In the last episode of Pinball. Without eyes and without memories, Noelle Sélevy woke to her own rescue. Two former soldiers, Saigō Satogaeri and Mick Strings, carried her from the Cambion factory, only to be struck down by an enemy known solely as AEGIS. Outmatched in every way, Noelle faced certain death until she fell into another world with the permission of the voice in the back of her head. For hours, the two kept the coarse atmosphere of the filter plate occupied with the sound of conversation. Well, chances are that only Noelle would be able to hear Byleth's strange, silk-soft mutterings, but it was otherwise empty, so that didn't much seem to matter. A range of topics were discussed in order to break the ice. How Byleth could prove that the planet Noelle called Earth had an actual physical engine in the center of it. How Cambion, like herself, could die only from injury and would otherwise live indefinitely. And how there was a god, in the traditional sense of the word, but it wasn't any of the popular ones. And in actual fact, most of their work was delegated to other, smaller gods in other, smaller departments. Byleth had been alive for longer than 1,000 years, depending on your personal definition of time, and during that time, they had inhabited more bodies than they could remember. Not a single one had been blind though, so rarely did they have the chance to do so much talking, and there were plenty of secrets to go around. Nevertheless, Noelle would inevitably find the longest sought answers were a tad upsetting or difficult to swallow, and she would have to stop asking and start listening. The singing cat made a sufficient tutor, if a succinct one. It seemed that Byleth was only interested in teaching Noelle the bare minimum, the difference between the sound of the filter plate and the sound of the stationary plate that she called home.
It is not in your best interest to visit the world above,
they explained.
There is not much space reserved for our kind.
Byleth's intensive training regime was easier to explain than it was to actually do. See, Noelle had to sit, preferably cross-legged, in the dirt and just listen. As she did this, the presence of the cat vanished in a wisp, and the 3 lines of indistinct noise became a part of her again. She could imagine them clear as day in the middle of her mindscape. It was hard to ignore them. No matter where she turned away, the lines soon caught up and overtook. One line bent at the middle, a fact that she was aware of, but only could detect if she really focused on it. This rounding off of the sound was all important. It represented the filter plate. If her attention faltered, the thick feeling of the lines faded away. Think of a piece of paper. When she tuned in, the words on the paper became embossed and legible, whereas when her mind wandered, it returned to regular old ink. On closer inspection, and with practice, it was evident that these so-called lines were actually made up of these audible fibers, these intricate layered soundscapes which she could single out and manipulate. Or she could one day. For now she needed to focus, for she did not know how long she had left. Presumably, her party had been captured, or were preparing to be moved back to prison by now. But if she could find them, maybe she could bring them here for safekeeping. It was difficult to apply the concept of time to this world. She had absolutely no manner with which to track its passing, nor could she feel anything that resembled it. She didn't seem to get tired at all. Just every now and again, Noelle would realize that they'd been sitting in silence for as long as she could remember, and she'd have to break the ice again in order to feel sane. She'd stand, and she'd stretch, and she'd walk amongst the nothingness for as long as she needed to, assured by Byleth that the filter consisted mostly of space. She couldn't put a number to it, but the two of them sat there going back and forth from silence of hard concentration to almost meaningless conversation for a day and a half minimum, before she was even allowed to attempt her return. Practice involved following the curved line and picking out the frequency that corresponded to something else in the filter. She found that if she pulled on a thread of sound a few feet ahead of her, she could move herself without standing up. Just a blip, and she was there. It became more and more clear that these noises were actually more like vibrations made by the motion of living beings, breathing space, and forces indefinable. It was a kind of divination. She could use it to sense rocks and the skeletons of old cars amongst the emptiness of the filter. By clenching that sound, by pulling it together by force, she could close the gap between herself and the object. Then, as she grew more and more confident in her manipulations, Byleth would tie off the other sounds to invisible concepts like gravity, luck, and calamity. "Whoa there," said Noelle. "Calamity?"
It is one side of a coin,
said the cat.
Calamity and integrity, the forces of change and of stasis. As its geography is defined by mortal byproducts, like memories of long-gone civilizations and dreams of massive contraptions, the filter plate is a beacon of integrity. As it grows larger with each and every mortal death, the eternal plate, as it is known, radiates calamity.
Noelle finished the thought herself. She had already come so far. "And the stationary plate is a mess of both. Don't worry," she said. "I can feel it." The noises that represented the eternal plate and the filter plate were two almost tranquil streams converging into one screaming river. And if she reached out in her mind and touched the running water within it, she would return to where the air tasted like salt and the wind was a cool mist on her skin. She could hear seabirds, and she could hear waves, and she could hear helicopters above her. Noelle did not return to the same spot that she had departed the stationary plate. It seemed she'd traveled quite the distance. If her ears could be believed, she'd arrived on the coast of whatever godforsaken island she'd been trapped on. "What would have happened if we'd gone into the water?" she asked. "I can't drown, can I?" As if the thought hadn't crossed their mind, she felt Byleth panic momentarily before they said,
Can you swim?
"I doubt it," she said, "but I don't need to breathe, do I?"
It wouldn't end well,
said Byleth, now collected.
but I would not allow it. I cannot possess you to do as I wish, Noelle, but I do have some freedoms, and I will not have you betray them. There is a classical paradox,
Byleth continued,
in which the hypothetical immortal's chance of being trapped indefinitely eventually always becomes 100%. If, or when, our coexistence ends, I will return to the filter plate, and you...
Byleth paused, as if they did not know the correct way to end their sentence, or as if they did not know the true answer at all.
Regardless, if you become trapped, I become trapped.
"You'd rather kill me, duly noted," said the girl. "Now, where do we go from here?" She chose to wait out the helicopters first. Once they'd fled the shoreside airspace, Noelle sat herself down again cross-legged as before and focused on the 3 straight lines. As if guided by Byleth's pause, she sought out the one in the center, solely the stationary plate. Amongst its musical fibers, she could hear the fluorescent hum of the sunlight and feel all the seams in the air. Think a little harder, and she could separate these sounds, tune into the frequencies, tell apart these natural, ambient sounds from the near artificial noise of the mortal soul. Like pistons buried deep underwater, she could hear the presence of people. They weren't too far from her position, and there were either a lot of them or one really big one. She couldn't quite tell if these pumping blips and peaks in the universal soundscape represented life. Then she could only assume that the length of the line itself defined the radius from which she drew this information. Long story short, Noelle guesstimated there was an enemy encampment not too far out from her, certainly within binocular range. She couldn't detect their movements, just their existence, meaning she needed to double the distance between them before she felt safe. It was hard to pin down her own range, for the island itself perpetuated a problem. Specifically, the shoreline made it difficult to concentrate as her semi-stable water metaphor collapsed under its own reality. Noelle turned herself away from the enemy force, took her focus from the center line to the bottom one, and let herself into the filter once more. She figured this one out without Byleth's assistance, though doing it made the back of her head hurt. Evidently, if they occupied similar space, movement in the filter plate meant movement in the stationary plate. She'd seen it done. She'd been nowhere near the ocean before coming back. It was almost like arriving in a different country. So, with confidence, Noelle shuffled forward across the sand, feeling her way through the nothingness. In retrospect, she should have counted her steps to work out the conversion rate, but she was far too busy rebuilding that confidence. Stumbles at first, then long, stoppered steps. Tentatively, she used the sounds and her outstretched hands to find her way around the first obstacle she'd come across. It was concrete, perhaps the wall of an old building. It crumbled under the pressure of her fingertips, and the dust that fell off it lingered lifelessly in the air around her face. It seemed to flake off in chips like lead paint. She followed it lengthways as far as she could until she came across vacant space that might have once held a glass window. It tripped her, and as she fell through it, she fell back into the stationary plate. Fortunately, the strange ring-shaped mask she'd been wearing hit the dirt before her teeth did. A mouthful of dust and dry grass told her she'd escaped the grasp of the ocean tide. Here, there was the electric heartbeat of commercial pylons, like radio interference. Elsewhere, she could hear rubber tires rolling on near-fresh asphalt, a sticky sound, and one far too close for comfort. With a bounce, she returned to the filter and began walking once more. "That building," she asked on the way, "where'd that come from?"
From memories,
said Byleth.
Images that perpetrated the mortal mind once would wind up in the filter plate over time, constructs and statues from ages past. But more recently, dwellings and technology. This is no longer the truth.
"Sounds like a mess," said Noelle.
"There is more space in the filter than you could possibly imagine,"
replied Byleth.
"In the early days of our existence, the architecture would fall from the sky. I have been hit by several pianos."
The next time Noelle surfaced on the stationary plate, she'd risen much higher above sea level and was somewhere near a waterfall. She pricked her ears following the torrent down to where it fueled a generator about half a mile across the way. She could detect a few beating hearts around her, but they were so minuscule that they could have only belonged to a family of hummingbirds. All this searching and seeking had only made her headache worse, and soon blood began to drip out from her ears. It began to pool under the mask. Her fingers found the clasp on each side, and it depressurized at her command. It confirmed one suspicion she'd had, which was that she was not a prisoner in shackles, though it did leave many other questions hanging. She could answer another herself, though. Noelle dropped the mask to the dirt, but it hit a rock on the way down, bounced, and then rolled down a nearby hill. A few steps back, for safety. Then she pawed at her own face, a cheek at first, where the metal had left an imprint on her skin. A little further up, till the tips of her fingers touched her eyelashes. Yes, as she'd assumed, her eyeballs had been removed. Might have been a surgery, but it could have been anything, judging how fast her friction burns had healed. Her eyelids were intact and sealed together. She couldn't pry them apart, not even with both hands. As she gave up, Noelle was grabbed from behind by two arms thicker than tree trunks and pulled backwards 2 steps further. "Noelle? You dopey bastard, you. Where have you been?" Was that Mick Strings, King of Things? It must have been. Anybody else that strong would have pulled her head off her goddamn body, but he appeared to be hugging her in what amounted to a full Nelson. "We've been looking for you for a fucking year, love. You just vanished." He let her go, and all of a sudden, she became aware of their twinned wavelengths. Saigō was there too, along with a third, smaller presence. It wasn't the baby, Nyoro. It was more like an animal, and it sounded like an animal too. Hold on, she said. "A year, Byleth?" She redirected the question. "I've been gone for a year?" "A year and a half," added Saigō, who then grasped Noelle's hand and shook it quite gently. She appeared to be wearing gloves now. "It's nice to see you, Noelle. Are you well?" "Well enough," she said, shaking back. Noelle told them her tale, where she'd gone, how she'd connected with her remnant, and how she'd only felt the passing of a few days. Then it was their turn. Nyoro was gone, and the party's goal had shifted in direction. After their encounter with the Gatherer, known more properly as the Ace of Cups, Saigō and Mick had woken up more or less unharmed, and where they'd been. Nyoro was Ace's only objective, evidence that the pervasive theory of a hollowed-out host could work, albeit inefficiently. But why, was the question. The passing time had given plenty of opportunity to find an answer. It took a little time to explain though, because Saigō tended to use company-specific jargon, and then Mick had to translate it into actual words for her. So they spoke whilst they returned themselves to the trio's campfire. In essence, it hinged on something that Noelle had noticed during that fight. It was that moment where Saigō had asked the child to look her in the eyes. Nyoro is host to Ipis, witness to the immediate timeline, began Saigō. She can see all that is bound to happen. Except, explained Mick, time's always changing, so she's only got 5 minutes ahead of the rest of us. Good for fighting, not for much else. April, who was leading Noelle via a rope leash constructed from a piece of Mick's outfit, bleated in agreement. Saigō, ahead of the pack, continued. If we made eye contact, I could preempt my opponent's movements. Mick nudged Noelle in the ribs. She just needs to touch you now. To get in your head, I mean. Noelle nudged him back. His running commentary was, in fact, not helping at all. She was having a difficult enough time as it was taking in the nonsense, especially considering the fact that she was also trying to figure out how much clothing Mick could possibly have left if that was his power. By this point, Saigō was already a few seconds into her ramble, and I don't know the nature of her plan, but the mother needs Nyoro alive, as she is. The Ace of Cups has her, still. That's why we're camped where we are, added Mick, and that's why we've got April here. He nudged Noelle again, but she didn't retaliate. April can sense him. Us. Cambion, he confirmed. Sense him, and dull him out. That's why I could sneak up on you. Saigō was talking still. She was saying, April S is assisting us. We're camped near a company waypoint, a citadel belonging to a mortal militia. Gatherers make regulated stops at these encampments, so eventually we'll catch her. Then I'll fucking give her what for, added Mick, dry punching the thin air. Noelle was confused again, but this time it felt a little reasonable. And then what? She asked. No offense, but you couldn't take her down on your own. What are you going to do against a battalion? Believe it or not, but the no-kill order still stands, said Saigō. And whenever I get my ass handed to me, I always come back stronger, added Mick. Plus, now we've got you back. Dusk fell, and the cicadas awoke before the party arrived at their doused campsite. By now, the wind had become rather cold, somewhat owed to the elevation of the area, and somewhat owed to a sly comment made by Mick earlier in the journey about Saigō's odd habit of collecting insects. She got him to make the jars, not that they lasted any longer than an hour. She was quite embarrassed about it. He only knew because he'd gotten suspicious about the sheer number of jars she'd been asking for. Mick lit the bonfire with a match constructed from the dead arm of a gum tree, and Saigō went off with uncharacteristic shyness. She took April off by the leash and went out to patrol the immediate area. Mick said she'd gotten restless, that he'd been feeling the same way for a long, long time now. He put his boot through an old, rain-logged wooden fence and used 3 splintered fragments to construct 2 stone mugs and a metal kettle. From a backpack, the King of Things produced fresh water and 2 sachets of tea, freeze-dried for longevity. A couple of weeks ago, he said, putting the water on to boil, we jumped a supply run from the capital. That's when we got old April. She's like the company mascot. Bit boring, mind you, but more than happy to help us out. She doesn't say much then? Asked Noelle. He scoffed. Not to me, but I think Bugsy's had a good word with her though. At least, enough to confirm what we already knew. Mick lifted the kettle off the burn, hissing under his breath as he rehydrated the powder. Fucking hell, he muttered. Fuck. Done. He lobbed the kettle about 150 feet away from them, where it proceeded to roll off the side of the hill. Hot. Sorry, here you are. Noelle took the stone mug in both hands, blew on it, and sniffed. Didn't smell of anything she recognized. A little smoky, nearly sweet. It was a heartfelt gesture, but it felt a little alien to her. It shouldn't have. It certainly seemed natural, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she'd not relaxed once in her whole life. Good, right? He asked her. It's that Russian caravan shit. Did you say capital? She said, sipping at the brew. It was a bit of an acquired taste, and there was also the threat that it may turn into something else in an hour or so. Do you know where we are? Oh, that's dead easy, he told her, though he didn't rush towards an answer. He let the silence hang a moment, as if to build the tension, cracked his fingers and downed his tea. The mug went in the fire. His hands went back to the backpack to retrieve a plastic package of cigarettes. You want one? Cigarette? Noelle shook her head. Just an answer, please, she told him. Alright, spicy. What were you before this, he asked, lighting the cig. A journo? It's Tasmania, love, and it's all theirs. Hell, the factory itself takes up a good chunk of it now, and it's only gotten bigger over the last 20 years. For the duration of Mick's cigarette, they sat in silence. Noelle didn't have much else to ask him. She half wanted to know how they'd managed to survive a year and a half on the outskirts of danger, but the idea that she might be missing 20 years of memories sent such a chill down her spine that her ribcage froze, and she could no longer produce vaporized word forms. Mick, though, was a bit of a talker. Can't believe you came back, though. Never seen anything like it. It was like you'd been a figment of my goddamn imagination. Honestly. He scooted closer, took one of her hands in his and squeezed. Palms like sandpaper where, instead of creases, he had welts and scars. I'm a lot stronger now, he said. I can take her. I mean it. You ain't got nothing to worry about now, love. Not when you're around Mick Strings, king of things. Why'd she call you the Pride? Asked Noelle. Back then, when you were fighting. She paused. She almost didn't want to say it. Made her feel silly. The Ace of Cups. It's fucking dumb, right? He squeezed her hand again. Fucking naming conventions, love. All depends on your rank, right? See, we all had a purpose from the get-go. Bugsy and I, we were both personal guards. Physically strong. You still with me? She nodded. Cool. We belonged to the father. Bastard of a man. Makes my goddamn skin crawl. He built us. Top to bottom, picked out 7 of us, each with a flaw that he saw as a benefit. The Sinful Project, said Mick. The pride and the gluttony. That's Saigō, on account of her power. The longer she uses it on you, the more you lose. Taste goes first, then your sight, your hearing. She tried to stop him mid-train of thought. Did you say built? But he didn't take any notice of her. He was on a bit of a roll, darting between the cigarette and the revelations. Ace belongs to the mother, and she bloody loves the tarot. Built? She repeated, snatching her hand back from him. You didn't think we were people, did you? Said Mick. Then he snapped his fingers. Fuck you're blind. If you could see yourself, you wouldn't question it. Nah, we just look like them. Heard someone once describe us as people-shaped people, built from bits, he told her, as he went for a hand once more. Clay and flesh and all sorts. We got green hair and red eyes, love. You can tell who's who, because we've got numbers tattooed beneath our thumbnails. I'm 07. And me? Asked Noelle. What number am I? He turned her hand around, studied the nails of her thumbs, hummed to himself and said, well, you were number 11, he told her. But you've been struck off the record. There's a line through both numbers. You're a reject, Noelle. You have been listening to Pinball, Measure 2, Andante, written and directed by Jake Lucy. This production is copyright 2021 by the Sleepy Bones Detective Agency. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, is purely coincidental. If you'd like to support the show, please visit us at patreon.com/SBDA. Please visit us on the web at sleepybones.agency for more surreal stories.